The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. Today I'll be joined by Bob Lowry, who is a premier expert in chemistry in the pool industry. And we're going to go over algaecides and the best way to fight and prevent algae in your pool. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Also receive priority service, enhanced rebate programs, a discount on your general liability insurance through SPA, a discount on your pool routing software through Skimmer, and an opportunity to co-brand with Leslie's on your social media, website, truck, and more. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro. So I'm joined again by Bob Lowry, and of course, if you don't know who Bob Lowry is, he's the premier chemistry expert in the pool industry. How are you doing this morning, Bob?
Doing great. Glad to see you all from Lima, Peru today.
We could list your accomplishments. It would take probably about most of the podcast here. Do you want to briefly just go over some of the highlights in maybe a minute or so that people can get an idea of where you're coming from?
Well, I've been a chemist in the swimming pool industry for 48 years. During that time, I've owned 2 chemical companies and a publishing company. I've written 21 books and I've developed 111 chemicals. And I've written about 30 white papers, about 15 or 20 technical bulletins. I've bothered to learn about how chemicals go in water. Spent my life doing it, and now I'm gladly giving that information back to homeowners or service techs or pool stores or anybody that will listen. I'm an independent chemist, and therefore the information that I give is my best opinion without regard to who makes it.
Yeah, with that said, I think we really appreciate your time when you give us this information, because you're a reliable source. And I think some of the questions that I get asked all the time, I just put them in these podcasts so that people can get the answers. And there's one coming up here from someone just a couple days ago. But we'll jump in here and we'll talk about pool algaecides. And the first question is, do you actually need an algaecide to treat algae in a pool?
Well, need is one of those definable words, I guess you might say. What's the definition of need? My first choice when it comes to algae is to just use chlorine. You already probably have it on your truck. You've probably got some liquid chlorine on your truck, or at least you can get some without much of a problem. And I would try that. But the problem is that most people don't add enough chlorine to really get rid of the algae. And that's where a process that was probably started by the folks over at Trouble Free Pools. They have a website called Trouble Free Pools, and they have a process they call SLAM. And I've been recommending this for years, but they have a formal program. What the essence of the program is to add a large amount of chlorine to the pool and then maintain that level for 24 to 48 hours. And most people don't want to maintain it for that long, and therefore they get not a complete kill. So this method on their website is called SLAM, shock level and maintain, and I just call it a hyperchlorination method. And what you do is you add 25 parts per million of chlorine or 40% of cyanuric acid, whichever is a greater amount. And you add that to the pool, and then you need a method of measuring chlorine that will measure 25 or 30 or 35 parts per million of chlorine, which is called an FAS DPD test kit. And it's a drop count or a titration. And it will go up to 50 or 60 parts per million. But anyway, it does it one drop at a time, and it's equal to 1 part or half a part per million. So at any rate, we add this amount of chlorine to the pool, we leave the pump on, we brush the pool, and then in the beginning, we check the chlorine level maybe once every hour or two and see if it's going down. When it goes down by three to 5 parts per million, then you add some more chlorine to get it back up to where you started. And then you keep doing that until you get only a 1 ppm change from night to morning or overnight. So if you're using 25 parts per million of chlorine, you check it in the morning. If it's 24 parts per million, then everything's dead. You only lost 1 part per million overnight. But if you check it in the morning and it's 15, you haven't killed everything. So you need to maintain that level long enough to where there's no change in a 10 to 12 hour period. And then you've killed everything. And it's difficult to do this method when the cyanuric acid level is above 100, because then you're looking at 40 parts per million of chlorine. So you could just drain some of the water, fill it back up, and now you could add 20 or 25 parts per million of chlorine and be good. So that's the number one method. And then you can start looking at algaecides. If for some reason that doesn't work, or for some reason you don't want to do that method, you can add an algaecide. And probably the best algaecide is a copper-based algaecide. Copper-based algaecides have two real problems. One is you need enough to kill the algae, but if you get too much, you can cause a stain. Many of the manufacturers use a sequestering agent in with the copper. So when you put it in the pool, even though you're at a higher level of copper, it won't cause any staining. That's the method, but it's not instant. So you don't put it in today and come back tomorrow and all your algae's gone. It doesn't work that way. As you might imagine, algae mature and colonize, and then they want to protect themselves. So they secrete a polysaccharide slime layer over top of themselves, which is kind of like a dome. And then they have the wall of the pool behind them. So they're ensconced in this little, in this little domed area. And this is what the algaecide or the chlorine has to break through to kill the algae. And this is the reason that we recommend that you brush the pool, because when you brush the pool, you break up that dome, and it allows the chlorine and algaecide to get into the algae and kill it. Just a reminder that when you've got algae, you really do need to brush, and twice a day is the recommended level, regardless of whether you're using which algaecide you're using. The other metallic algaecides are silver, and there are silver-based algaecides. They do a fair job too. The problem is that copper doesn't kill algae very quickly, and so it's not instant like chlorine is. So you do need to give it enough time to work. You also need to make sure that you've got it works better when the alkalinity is a little bit high and the pH is a little bit low. So it actually works better under those conditions. So when you're going to use a copper algaecide, I would probably shock to maybe 5 or 10 parts per million of chlorine first, and then a day or so later, put the copper in. That way, the algaecide or the algae itself are a little bit shocked from having so much chlorine, and they're vulnerable then to the copper-based algaecide. You do the same thing with silver. The danger with silver is that you oxidize the silver and make silver oxide, which is the same stuff that's on the old 35 millimeter black and white negatives. That is silver oxide. So at any rate, you run the risk of perhaps causing a stain if you get too much chlorine in there with the silver. And then, of course, there are what are called polyquats, and these are polymers that are a mixture of a polymer and a quaternary amine compound. And they are are pretty good, but they do function a little bit as a clarifier. The polymer part of their structure is similar to a polymer like we use for clarifying water. And so we can end up having that product actually work like a clarifier and end up in the filter, which is not where the algae is. The algae is in the pool. So there is a possibility of doing that, but they are good, and they are good at preventing algae long term. So they're good as a long-term algicide. And I think finally we have what are called quat algaecides. And many of these algaecides, they dilute them down quite a bit and sell them as a cheap algaecide where you can buy a gallon for $10 or something like that. You know, a lot of times a quart of algaecide will cost from $15 to $25, and you can buy a gallon for $10 or $15. It seems like a bargain, but it's actually just very dilute, either copper or polyquat algaecide. The danger with a quat algaecide is that if you use it a few times or a couple of times, it's very close to being a surfactant. And as a result, if you use it, you can get some foaming in the pool. I'm not sure if that's the whole gamut of algaecides, but I think it is.
I think you got most of them there, Bob. Just real quick, back to the SLAM method that you mentioned. I think for the Pool Pro, it's harder for us to do that method because you'd have to go back to the account a few times during that day. And, you know, we really can't return usually until the next day on that method. And so I do what I call shock and awe, or I'll put in 50 parts per million of chlorine in the pool. And then by the next day when I go back there, usually it holds pretty well. So we kind of have to modify that a little bit to put a little bit more chlorine in. That way we don't have to keep measuring it every couple hours, because we can't really do that. And I think that's why a lot of us rely on the algaecides also, because that kind of helps speed things up in a way, I guess, without having to kind of monitor it like that. But for a homeowner, the SLAM process is highly effective. If you look at the thread at the Trouble Free Pool site, people have really great success with that method. Yeah. And I agree that it works really effectively.
Well, you're right for a service tech, and perhaps you know, going up to 50% of the cyanuric acid level is maybe a good method. So maybe using 50 parts per million of chlorine is you know, maybe double or a little less than what I would recommend than what I was recommending. But you know, 50 and come back the next day. I would guess though, from a working standpoint, if you put in 50 and you come back the next day and there's less than 30 parts per million left in the pool, you probably need to go back up to 50 and do it again.
Yeah, it happens a lot too, where you come back the next day and it's, you know, under 3 parts per million, and sometimes it's even at 0, because sometimes we deal with pools that are extremely neglected that more than likely probably need to be drained versus, you know, cleared up with chemicals. But here in California, draining a pool, in fact, I just heard yesterday that we're probably going to be under another drought this year, and there's going to be a lot of restrictions. I know Northern California already implemented some, and so draining a pool in some areas just is not something that can be done. And so chemical-wise is kind of how we do it, by just shocking it. And in your opinion, can you turn a pool around that's been green for a long time with just chemicals, or is it better off just draining that pool?
No, you can do it chemically, but you have to realize that when you do it chemically, you may be increasing something in the pool and have to add something else. So ultimately, you're going to be increasing TDS and perhaps some of the other things. So TDS is not such a great thing as far as, you know, you're not going to increase it so much that you need to drain it right away, because there's a lot of leeway with TDS. But I think you can do it successfully. And of course, you can flock the pool with alum, and it gets rid of some algae that's floating in the pool, but it also gets rid of some other things in the water where guys like Rudy are claiming that that by adding it, you can lower cyanuric acid and phosphates and things like that. And so it's possible that we can use some alum and get rid of some of the stuff in water. And then when we vacuum to waste, we're only using losing an inch or two of water from the pool and replacing that. But we are lowering some of the other things that are in the water, TDS and cyanuric acid, and the pool will function better when we get rid of some of that stuff.
I guess the other question is the use of sodium bromide. I know you didn't mention that when you were talking about the algaecides, but
Yeah, I didn't. I wasn't an on-purpose thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. Sodium bromide is an effective algaecide, and many of these products are labeled as yellow something. The original product out there had a patent on it. It was called Yellow Tree. I'm sorry, Yellow Out.
there's like a lot
Well,
of them that sound a lot
there's a
alike.
bunch of other Yellow Stop, Yellow
Yeah.
Tree, Yellow Treat. They're all yellow something. And the idea was it would stop yellow algae. But the original one, I think, was Yellow Out. At any rate, that one had an ammonium salt base, and the rest of the products, because the first one had a patent on it, the rest of the products have sodium bromide in it. And sodium bromide algaecides are effective, but you must understand that when you add any amount of bromide to the pool, that bromide is in the water as a bromide ion. And when the ion is in water, when you add an oxidizer to the water, it changes the bromide ion into hyperbromous acid, which is like hypochlorous acid. And then it becomes a sanitizer and it destroys things, and then it goes back to being a bromide ion, just like chlorine in water is hypochlorous acid. When it's all finished being hypochlorous acid, it goes to being chloride. So same idea, except that when you add chlorine or any other oxidizer to the pool, bromide gets reactivated to hyperbromous acid. And that means if you've added many of these products, sodium bromide products, you are actually adding about 5 parts per million of bromide to the water. And this means that up to 5 parts per million of chlorine gets converted into 5 parts per million of bromine. So you no longer have a chlorine pool. You have a bromine pool, and you may not even know it. And the reason that this is important to understand is that the bromide doesn't go away. So when you add chlorine, it makes hyperbromous acid, it makes bromide, and the next time you add chlorine, it does the same thing. So it continues to do that forever until the bromide is gone. And the bromide only gets reduced when there's a water loss. And it can get reduced when bromide makes a compound that doesn't go back to bromide. So it can make a bromochloroamine or bromochloro ammonium. Then it takes it out of the system. But for the most part, the bromide is there, and you've got a bromide pool, and it doesn't go away. And bromide is not protected from sunlight degradation. Bromide is used up at the rate of 65% in 2 hours. And so you lose all of the chlorine level or all the bromine level in about 5 hours. It's important that you know that. And it's also important to know if you've got a bromine pool, instead of 2 to 4 parts per million of chlorine, you actually need 4 to 6 parts per million of bromine. And you need a bromine test kit. You need to be aware that if you use a bromide product, this can happen. And I am not trying to spread a rumor, but I have heard from the PHTA that EPA is considering outlawing sodium bromide algaecide.
I've heard the same thing too through the grapevine. Different sources have told me the same thing, that for a number of reasons they're considering that. And I think So I think manufacturers are already starting to taper back on some of the sodium bromide products ahead of time, just like
Well,
with the.
the big reason is this, that when you put bromine in water, you run the possibility of making bromate. And bromates are cancer causing. And that's the reason that EPA looks at it, is there's a possibility that you can be making bromates in your pool. It's not such a big problem in spas. It is a problem in spas that if they put sodium bromide in the spa and then use an ozonator, that makes bromate, and that is cancer causing. But spas are mostly covered, and so we don't have sunlight in them. But when you have bromide in water, it can make bromate from sunlight, and bromates are bad. And so I think that's probably why EPA is looking at it, and ultimately it's going to be gone. So those are some reasons not to use it. But if you are using it, that's the awareness.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I should mention is that I was talking to the people over at Natural Chemistry. They make their phosphate remover, and I was bringing this point up is that I've done tests where I've had algae in a spa, and I'll pour the phosphate remover directly into the spa, and then within a few minutes the algae is gone, but the phosphate remover is not technically an EPA algaecide. So how does it work in removing the algae from the pool then in that respect?
Okay, the algae, as you might guess, have to reproduce pretty quick because they're usually single cell, and so they have to multiply quickly to replicate and reproduce themselves. And so the main nutrient of algae is phosphates. And so if there's phosphate around, that's their main food source. So they look at their main food source, and if you remove phosphate, you have taken away their main source of food. Now, they still do need carbon because they are carbon-based plants and they need sunlight, but there's other things in the water that they can use. You can't get rid of the carbon in the pool. That's impossible because you've got carbonates, bicarbonates, carbonic acid, and CO2 in the water. So there's plenty of carbon for them. That's for photosynthesis. That's not as a nutrient. Phosphates are number one. Number two is probably nitrates and then sulfates. And there may be some sulfates in the water. Certain products have sulfate in them. And so when you use them, you increase the sulfate level, and then you can have an algae problem because it's feeding on the sulfate. And as you might guess from the name, potassium monopersulfate, MPS, non-chlorine shock, has sulfate in it. But at any rate, phosphate is something that we don't want to get the level too high. If you ask the manufacturers, they're going to tell you it's, 200, 500, something like that is the maximum. Mm-hmm. I think that probably you don't need to worry about them till they're, 1,500, maybe 2,000. And if you're going to use borate in the pool, which I know we're getting a little off topic, but if you use borate in the pool, which is an algaestat instead of an algaecide, you probably don't need to remove the phosphate at all because it prevents the algae. Even if you have phosphate in there, if you kill the algae and then the borate prevents it, you don't need a phosphate remover though because there's no algae being formed.
We're talking about algaecides, but what would be the best way to prevent algae in the first place? I know that we talked many times before about balancing the pool water, and that's a key factor. A lot of homeowners and pool pros still deal with algae on a regular basis for a number of reasons. And Rudy just has a new book out about that, which I think is really well done as far as pointing out some of the environmental factors that cause algae. But besides those points, what would be like some of the key takeaways in some ways to prevent the algae from even forming in the first place? And you mentioned borates, and we can touch on that more too.
One of the things that I researched, and the advantage I have as an independent chemist is that owning my own company and being independently wealthy, I can go and spend 1,000 hours doing something, and I don't have a boss telling me I'm wasting my time, or, don't do that. We're not going to make any money from that, or whatever. So I can go research something until I'm satisfied I have all the information. And one of the things I did about 8 years ago was I started studying how much chlorine we need in the water to kill things, and recognizing that algae are harder to kill than bacteria. So in a residential pool, and we are talking residential, in a residential pool, I found out that most everybody agreed that somewhere between 0.03 and 0.05 parts per million HOCl, hypochlorous acid, kills algae. And some people disagree with the 0.03, and other people say 0.05. So in the process of finding that out, everybody that I talked to or listened to or read about would agree that 0.05 would kill algae. 0.03, maybe, maybe not. So to be sure that we killed it, I settled on 0.05. We can actually calculate how much chlorine is in the pool. And the calculation goes like this. When you have more than 30 parts per million of cyanuric acid in the pool, 97% of the chlorine is bound to cyanuric acid. And this only leaves 3%. So there's only 3% of the chlorine in the pool at any time that's doing anything. And that 3% is in equilibrium with the 97%. So as some of the 3% gets used, it gets replaced from the 97. And it keeps maintaining that 97 and 3% until there's no more chlorine left in the pool. So it maintains that. So we know that there's only 3% of the chlorine in the pool. We also know that at a pH of 7.5, 50% of the chlorine is HOCl and 50% is OCl minus. From that, we can determine that the amount of HOCl in any pool is only 1.5%. Okay, so now that we have 1.5% and we know we need 0.05 parts per million, let's multiply 2 parts per million times 1.5%. And what that gives us is 0.03. And that's not enough chlorine to kill algae. It's not. So now let's do 3 parts per million of chlorine. 3 parts per million of chlorine times 1.5% is 0.045. That's almost enough to kill algae. It's only 5,000ths away from killing algae. So it probably would kill algae. And if we do 4 parts per million, 4 parts per million times 1.5% is 0.06. And that will kill algae. So we can actually calculate how much chlorine it takes to kill algae.
I think the problem, though, Bob, is when the cyanuric acid level then is at 100, then what kind of chlorine level do we need to kill algae?
And this is I was going to take it the next step farther. Rather than homeowners doing that calculation, we have determined that if you use a chlorine level that is 7.5% of the cyanuric acid level, you will always have enough chlorine in the pool to prevent and kill algae. So if that can become your minimum, and that's really great. We now have a method of determining how much chlorine you need in your pool. And yes, you're right. I know what you're thinking. Well, what if I have 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid? Technically, you need 7.5 parts per million of chlorine to prevent algae. And if you're only chlorinating at 2 to 4 parts per million of chlorine, you don't have enough chlorine in the pool. That's why you get algae. And so the thing to do is lower the chlorine level and then take 7.5% of 50, and that comes up to 3.75. So you need almost 4 parts per million of chlorine in the pool, not 2, but 4, to keep algae from coming. And I'll take it one step farther, because we teach this in our institute and in our books. If you add borate to the pool at 50 parts per million, then you use 5% of cyanuric acid instead of 7.5. So now you need a chlorine level that's 5% of CYA, and even if you've got 80 parts per million of CYA, you still only need 4 parts per million of chlorine.
So a pool with 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid, if you add borates to 50 parts per million, you would just need 5%.
You need
5 parts per million, sorry.
5 parts per million. But that's the minimum. And if you're trying to run the pool at 2, even though people say, oh my God, 2 is a big amount. If you're running the pool at 2, you run the risk of getting algae. You don't have enough chlorine in the killing form.
Yeah, so for the pool pros out there that have pools that are 100 parts per million or 150 parts per million, I think one of the things they're battling is that every week they're getting algae in there and they're scratching their heads thinking, well, the chlorine level is high, it's 5 parts per million or whatever. But as you're saying here, that wouldn't be enough to kill algae. I mean, there's chlorine in the water, but at that level of cyanuric acid, you're going to have an algae problem no matter what, unless you raise it up.
Even at 5 parts per million, you still don't have enough chlorine to kill the algae.
Yeah.
So, and then you kill it, and then it's gone for a while. And because you're under chlorinating, you come back to the same thing and you think, how come I'm getting recurring algae? How come? You're not. You're just not ever keeping enough chlorine in the pool to keep the algae away. One of the things that you can do with regard to algaecides, we talked about use whatever you want to do. Use the SLAM, use a high level of chlorine, use a hyperchlorination, use copper, whatever. When the algae's gone, put in borate. You put borate in, algae doesn't get started after that. Mm-hmm. And that's the advantage, is that you put that in the pool and it prevents algae from getting started. It's not an algaecide, so if you got algae growing in the pool, it's not going to kill it. But if you put it in the water with no algae in it, you're not going to get any algae coming in. We had a guy that was in one of our classes said he had 70% of his pools with a chlorine generator on them. And he was running his pools at 70 parts per million of borate. And he said the day after he was at this pool, the chlorine generator stopped working. He came back 6 days later in Southern California, came back 6 days later, there's no algae in the pool because he's got 70 parts per million of borate in there.
That's pretty amazing. I've mentioned before my test here at my own pool where I've left with 3 weeks with no chlorine. Of course, I wasn't swimming in it, and I had the borate level of 50 parts per million, and there was no algae at all for that 3-week period. And then just as a side note, just recently I got a salt system from my dad in Indio, California, and I told him to put the borates in his pool. He just drained it, refilled it, put the salt system on, and he's having trouble. He was having trouble all week long trying to get the salt system to work, getting the salt level right. And with the borates in there at 50 parts per million, I told him, don't worry about it, just keep working at it. And for a whole week at 90-degree weather in Indio, he had no chlorine in the pool and had no algae, and he was just trying to modulate that salt system. And so it's highly effective. I mean, it's amazing actually when you think about it, how effective it is.
Yeah, it's great stuff, and I think literally every pool should have it in there. And believe me, I don't make any money if you put a borate in your pool or not. I don't make a penny if you do it. So it's just good advice. I think it's a great chemical.
Well, we'll end here with that, and then I think that was a great prepper on algae for anyone listening. And I think the takeaway here is that the chlorine level needs to be 7.5% of the cyanuric acid to be effective. And I think that's one part of the equation that a lot of people are missing when they're trying to treat algae in the pool. They're wondering why it's not going away because the chlorine level seems good to them, but in actuality it's not good enough based on the cyanuric acid level. So I think that's key to the fighting algae. So I hope you found this podcast helpful, and I hope you can tune in for the other episodes that I recorded in this series. I want to talk to Bob Lowry about using borates in your pool and some of the benefits and the fact that it's not a magic bullet in the next podcast. We're going to touch on a pool with a leak, and we're also going to cover total dissolved solids, or TDS, in the last 2 podcast episodes. And if you're looking for the episodes in this series, you can, of course, look at the links in the description. I'll have all of them listed there. Or go to my website, swimmingprolearning.com, and on the banner, click on the podcast icon. That'll take you to a drop-down list of the podcast episodes that I recorded with Bob Lowry. and also the other podcasts that I recorded here. With over 600 different podcasts, you can definitely find a recording that's going to be interesting at the time you're going to need it, or if you're looking for certain information. I'll probably have a podcast on that subject. And if you're in the industry and you're looking to enhance your business, definitely check out my coaching program at poolguycoaching.com. A lot of great benefits for joining there. Again, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Pool Service Pro. Open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro.